Hello, my name is Cherlyn Coleman. I'm a senior here at Francis Marion University, and I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Jones. She's part of the biology department here at Francis Marion, and we were looking at the effects of acute ibuprofen exposure on COX-2 transcription in larval fathead minnows. Our hypothesis is that environmentally relevant concentrations of ibuprofen will affect COX-2 gene transcription in fathead minnows. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what the heck is COX-2 gene? And I'm glad you asked. It codes for an enzyme that's responsible for inflammation and pain. One of the major things that we look at in introduction up here is looking at how pharmaceutical waste in natural water systems it seems to be growing in the United States, and they seem to be having a huge effect on our aquatic ecosystems. It has a huge effect that we don't think about on a daily basis, but it can stunt growth, it can affect vital organs, and ultimately lead to death for our little aquatic babies. So one of the things that we decided to use was ibuprofen. And as we can see, ibuprofen is an anti-inflammatory medication. We probably already knew that. But what you probably didn't know is that it also inhibits the COX-2 gene that we talked about up here. The one that I told you, I'm glad you asked. Yeah, that one. So once again, just a reminder that it codes for an enzyme that's responsible for inflammation and pain. So down here, I'd like to look at our methods. Our methods was it went over a 48-hour period. And we looked at 5 treatments with 3 replicates per treatment. So we looked at control, which was dechlorinated city water. We had the vehicle control, which was 60 micrograms per liter of acetone. And just to go ahead and give you a side note of that, with that acetone, we used it to dissolve our ibuprofen, but we also wanted to be sure that it didn't have any effect on the other control concentration groups as we went further down. So that was our vehicle control. We had our low concentration, which consisted of 10 micrograms per liter of ibuprofen. We had our medium concentration, which consisted of 100 micrograms per liter of ibuprofen. And then we had our high concentration, which consisted of about 1,000 micrograms per liter. On a daily basis, we came back around 2 p.m. And over the course of the 48 hours that I talked about. And these are just a few of the things that we looked at. We looked at the survival count, dissolved oxygen levels, pH levels, and our temperature. And they were suckers, let me tell you. These fathead minnows looked like little gnats. So it was a tricky job, but it was interesting to see what we would come back to and what the differences would be in that area. After 48 hours, we took the larvae and we put them and we froze them under in -degree Celsius until it was ready for analysis. And when we took it out, we wanted to extract RNA, and we also wanted to change that RNA into DNA in order to be ready for prep for our qPCR. What is qPCR? I'm glad you asked. So qPCR allows us to measure the number of gene copies in a sample. Now, let's look at some results to all of this. First off, I'd like to point out me over here looking all good and studious, and these are our control groups that I talked about. Looking over these, I have this tool in my hand that's measuring the dissolved oxygen and pH levels. Back to what I was talking about over here in this method section with the daily monitoring over the 48 hours. So that's what I was doing right here in this figure 1. Now with table 1, we're looking at the mortality and water quality. Low mortality rates suggest that there weren't any treatment effects on survival. Environmental conditions were stable throughout the experiment and among treatments, so everything was similar, and therefore any effects we might see would be from the ibuprofen and not the environmental conditions. And just looking at here, we have the mortality rates that I was talking about. And over here, we have our dissolved oxygen, which was in milligrams per liter. We have our pH here. And we have our temperature, which was in degrees Celsius. The next table I'd like for you to look at is this table 2, which was RNA extraction. And just looking at this middle table right here with the RNA concentration shows that we had sufficient amount of RNA, which was really good to see. Another thing that I'd like you to see, which looks a little tricky, but it's easy to understand once I go through it. The 260-80 ratio. Now, 260-80 ratio lets us know that there weren't any contaminants. You know, it shows us just how pure our RNA was. And normally it's around the number of 2, but lucky for us, I'm just patting myself in the back here, we got around 2.2, which was pretty good. So that showed us what those contaminants were and just showing us how pure our RNA was. Now I'd like to show you our figure 2 up here, which was relative expression of COX-2 gene. Now when we're looking at this, we're looking at our qPCR, which allows us to measure the number of gene copies in the sample. the number of gene copies in our treatment groups weren't significantly different than the gene copies in our control. And what I mean by that is when we're looking right here at our control group, as you go down the table, we have right here our vehicle control, our low concentration, our medium concentration, and our high concentration. And as you can see, looking at the data, it doesn't go any different than our control group right here that I'm showing you, and therefore there was no significant difference. To verify all this data that I'm just telling you about, we also used the one-way ANOVA, which was also known as the analysis of variance, and our p-value was 0.88, which was relatively high, once again showing that there wasn't any significant difference than the gene copies in our control group that you see right here. So, in our conclusion, our results indicate no significant change in COX-2 transcription following 48-hour exposure to environmentally relevant ibuprofen. Now, even though we didn't see any results, we do know that there's some future work that can be done in order to see other results and things that we haven't thought about. One of the biggest things I want to point out, right here, where it says we could use chronic. As I said in the title, we looked at the effects of acute ibuprofen exposure. One of the biggest things we could have done was see them over a chronic period of time, just seeing how long that, what the effects would be after more than 48 hours and looking into those effects. Also monitoring the fish throughout the development determine whether exposure had any effects on their phenotypic defects or anything like that. When you're looking at it, remember I told you we looked at our results over here in table 1. We looked at total mortality, dissolved oxygen, pH, and temperature. But we could have done so much more. Just like I talked about introduction. Over here we talked about how with this waste in the water, it could it would stunt growth, it could affect the vital organs, and what I say right here, it can cause death eventually. So that's something else that we could eventually look over if we had more exposure to the ibuprofen. Measured concentrations of ibuprofen accumulated in fish tissue, and we could have measured activity of the enzyme which the COX-2 gene encodes to determine whether enzyme ibuprofen elicits similar physiological effects as in humans. Well, those were our conclusions, and I'd like to say thank you to Ready to Experience Applied Learning, and I'd also like to thank you all for listening.